I was sipping my morning tea when the envelope slid through the slot, landing on the worn rug by my door. Heavy cream paper, my full name typed neatly, and the faint scent of ink that reminded me of old libraries. Inside, a single page. You are hereby invited to the Sinclair Estate Settlement Meeting, to be held on the 14th of October at 10 a.m. Attendance is required to confirm beneficiary arrangements. Required. That word curled in my stomach like a stone. I read it twice, then a third time. It had been 15 years since I'd last set foot in the family estate. 15 years since my brother's funeral, the last time we all stood under the same roof without pretending civility. The Sinclair estate was more than a house. It was a century of births, deaths, arguments whispered over brandy, and the steady creak of floors that knew too many secrets. I had grown up in those rooms, had my first kiss in its walled garden, and hid under the dining table during one of my father's infamous holiday speeches. And now they were dividing it. I folded the letter carefully, though my hands had begun to tremble, and set it beside my untouched tea. The taste had already gone bitter. The drive to the estate felt longer than I remembered. The road curved through fields gone pale with autumn, and each turn seemed to peel away another layer of the years I'd been absent. When I reached the iron gates, they were already open. The house loomed beyond, its windows glinting cold in the morning light. Inside the foyer I was greeted by Henry, my late brother's son, and his wife Marissa. Henry kissed my cheek, quick and perfunctory, as if I were an old colleague rather than his father's sister. "Aunt Evelyn," he said warmly enough to be polite. "Glad you could make it." Marissa's smile was a different thing altogether, wide, bright, and empty. "We weren't sure you'd come. It's such a long trip for you at your age." I caught the faintest glance between them, quick as a match strike. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, unbuttoning my coat. "Oh, of course," Marissa said, her voice syrupy. "Though most of the arrangements have already been discussed. Today is more of a formality." Formality. Another stone in my stomach. Her words settled like dust on old furniture, soft but impossible to ignore. I looked past them into the grand hall. The portraits of our ancestors stared down from the walls, their painted eyes sharp, as if they'd heard every word. While Henry and Marissa disappeared into the study with a few other relatives, I drifted down the corridor, letting my fingers graze the polished wood of the banister. The house smelled the same: beeswax polish, faint lavender from the old linen cupboards, and something else beneath it all: time. I paused in the drawing room, where the morning sun angled through tall windows, spilling across the Persian rug my mother had insisted on importing from Istanbul. I remembered lying there as a girl, tracing the patterns with my finger, pretending they were maps to far-off worlds. In the library, dust floated in slanted beams of light. I ran a hand over the leather-bound spines, each one embossed with my father's monogram. He had been a man of few affections, but these books had been his sanctuary, and sometimes mine. We spent winter evenings here, the fire snapping in the grate while he read aloud, his voice low and steady. At the far end of the room hung a portrait of my parents on their wedding day. My mother's dress was simple, her smile small but certain. My father's eyes, sharp, assessing, seemed to follow me even now. The years fell away as I walked those halls. I could hear my brother's laughter echoing from the kitchen, smell the cinnamon from our mother's Christmas bread, feel the cold marble under my bare feet when we'd sneak downstairs for stolen slices of pie. And yet, in every room, there was a shadow of absence. So many chairs empty. So many voices silenced. This wasn't just property. It was memory, lineage, the soil my life had grown from. To watch it pass into careless hands felt like erasing an entire language. I was looking for the powder room when I passed the old study, my father's domain when he was alive. The door stood half open, and I caught the low murmur of voices inside. No one noticed me in the doorway. Henry was leaning over the great oak desk, his back to me, while Marissa and my cousin Stephen peered at a spread of papers. I might have walked on, if not for the glimpse of my own family crest embossed at the top of the page. On the desk lay a neat stack of legal documents, the kind printed on thick cream-colored paper that smells faintly of ink and money. I stepped closer, silently, my shoes muffled by the rug. Across the top, in bold, preliminary beneficiary allocation. The columns were crisp, each name followed by a list of properties, investments, and estimated values. I scanned the page once. My eyes reached the bottom of the list, and there it ended. Henry, Marissa, Stephen, their children, a few distant cousins I barely knew, and then nothing. No Evelyn Sinclair. No acknowledgement that I had ever been part of this bloodline, that my childhood and my memories were born in these very rooms. It was as if someone had taken a blade and cut me clean out of the story. "We just need to finalize with the solicitor next week," Marissa was saying, her tone brisk. "Once it's signed, there's no reversing it." "Good," Henry murmured. "The fewer people involved, the less mess." A slow burn started in my chest. Not shock, that had passed in the first 10 seconds, but something heavier. Answer. I stepped back into the corridor before they could see me, my hand braced against the wall. The polished wood felt cold under my palm. It wasn't just about money. It was about erasure. I hadn't meant to linger, truly. But the corridor outside the study was narrow, and the voices carried as if the walls themselves wanted me to hear. "She's 72, Marissa's voice floated out, smooth and deliberate. "It wouldn't take much to convince her this is for the best. A small stipend, maybe. Something that looks generous on paper." Henry gave a short laugh, one I recognized from when he was a boy and thought he was being clever. "She's sentimental, not stupid. If she suspects she's being cut out, she might contest it." "She won't," Marissa said quickly. "She hates conflict. Always has. Besides, she's lived without this place for years. We'll frame it as simplifying the estate. Less stress for her." The sound of shuffling papers. Stephen spoke next, his tone lower, conspiratorial. "And if she does get difficult?" Marissa's voice turned brittle. "Then we remind her of the upkeep costs. Taxes. The endless repairs. Make it sound like a burden she's lucky to escape." I stood perfectly still, my hand against the cold wall, my heart beating slow but hard. They weren't just excluding me. They were building a story, one in which I was the grateful bystander, relieved to be spared the weight of our family's legacy. A legacy I had scrubbed floors for as a child when mother fell ill. A legacy I had contributed to with my own wages when the roof leaked one bitter January, and my father refused to take a loan. A legacy I had fought to protect when developers tried to buy up the surrounding fields in the 1980s. And now they were rewriting me out of it. Politely, efficiently, and with smiles they'd rehearse in the mirror. I felt a strange calm steal over me, the kind that comes when the worst suspicion is confirmed. This wasn't about what I deserved. This was about what they thought they could take while I stayed quiet. I eased away from the doorway before the conversation could shift. My footsteps were soundless on the rug, but inside my chest, a decision was beginning to solidify. Heavy, immovable, like stone setting in the foundation of a house. By the time I reached the far end of the hall, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They thought silence was my weakness. They were about to learn it was my weapon. The west sitting room had always been my refuge, even as a child. It was the smallest in the house, tucked behind the main parlor, with low ceilings and windows that caught the late afternoon sun. Few guests ever came in here. It was too modest for show. I slipped inside and closed the door softly, leaning against it for a moment. The quiet wrapped around me like an old shawl. Outside, I could hear the faint echo of footsteps in the grand hall, the low murmur of cousins catching up, the occasional burst of laughter that felt sharp in my ears. I crossed to the window and looked out over the back lawn. The gardens were overgrown now, but I could still trace the old paths my mother and I had walked each summer. Her arm hooked through mine, a basket swinging between us, the air heavy with the scent of roses. I thought of my father at his desk, ledger open, muttering about taxes and repairs while I stood in the doorway, offering to take a second job to help with the expenses. He never thanked me outright, but he didn't refuse the money either. I thought of the winter of '94, when the pipes burst in the east wing. I'd driven through a snowstorm to bring supplies, staying 3 days to help patch and paint so the damage wouldn't spread. My hands bled from scrubbing, but I told myself it was worth it. We were preserving something that belonged to all of us. All of us. Now, all apparently meant everyone but me. I pressed my fingertips to the glass, cold seeping into my skin. The idea of walking away, of letting them paint me as the fragile, compliant aunt who didn't need or want her share, made something deep inside me recoil. I wasn't sentimental enough to fight for every brick of this house. But I was proud enough to refuse erasure. This estate wasn't just money in a ledger. It was the spine of our family history, and they were trying to break it in the very place my name should stand. I turned from the window and took a slow breath. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was steady, measured. This wasn't about confronting them in a burst of anger. That would only feed their narrative of me as emotional, unfit. If they wanted quiet, they would get it, but on my terms. I would speak only to those who could act. My solicitor, the archivist who kept the family records, perhaps even the bank manager who still remembered my father's stern handshake. I would gather every document, every deed, every faded letter that tied my name to this estate. I would make my presence undeniable in ink and law. They wanted me out of the picture. I would make sure the picture couldn't exist without me. By the time I opened the door again, my shoulders felt lighter. I walked back into the corridor, past portraits of Sinclairs long gone, their faces stern, their eyes steady. For the first time all morning, I met their painted gazes without flinching. I began the next morning, before the mist had even lifted from the lawn. No announcements, no phone calls to the family. I simply dressed, pulled on my wool coat, and slipped out while the house was still stirring. The first stop was the attic, a place I hadn't seen in decades. The door groaned on its hinges, releasing the dry scent of cedar and dust. Sunlight pushed in through the small round window, illuminating the shapes of old trunks, stacked crates, and furniture draped in yellowed sheets. I knew where to start. In the far corner sat a trunk with a brass latch, one my mother had called her memory chest. I knelt beside it, my knees protesting, and lifted the lid. Inside lay the past. Pressed flowers in brittle scrapbooks, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, and near the bottom, a folder of official papers. The tax receipts in my father's precise handwriting. A 1964 letter from the family solicitor, acknowledging the property as jointly held by James and Evelyn Sinclair, with right of survivorship. I sat there for a long moment, the paper cool in my hands. They could pretend I had no claim, but the ink said otherwise. I took everything relevant and slipped it into my leather satchel, wrapping the papers in a cloth to keep them dry. From the attic, I went to the linen cupboard on the second floor, where I remembered my father once hid the family ledgers during a financial scare in the 70s. The cupboard was shallow, its back panel loose. Behind it, exactly as I recalled, was a flat tin box. Inside I found more ledgers, notes in the margins in my mother's softer script, and a small envelope addressed to me in her hand. I didn't open it then. Some things you save for when the work is done. By midday, I was in the town library, the one my family had helped fund decades ago. The archivist, Mrs. Halloway, still recognized me. Her eyebrows rose when I explained I needed copies of every land record with my name attached. "Of course, Miss Sinclair," she said, her voice carrying the old courtesy that seemed to belong to another time. "We've kept them all. Your family's history is part of the town's history." She led me to the back, where we pored over bound volumes and microfilm. Each time my name appeared alongside the estate, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Another stitch in the fabric they thought they could tear apart. By the time I returned to the house, the sun was dipping low, casting the long shadows I'd known since childhood. My satchel was heavy, not just with paper but with proof. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I passed Henry in the hall. He glanced at the bag but didn't ask. His confidence was still intact. But the quieter I moved, the deeper the cut would feel when they finally saw what I'd been doing. The Sinclair family solicitor, Mr. Archer, had offices in a brick building that seemed to lean slightly into the wind, as though bracing against the decades. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of old books and polished wood. I had called him the night before. No pleasantries, just a request for an appointment at your earliest convenience. He gave me 10 a.m. today. His receptionist, a young man in a grey waistcoat, took my coat and offered tea. I declined. My hands were too full with the satchel to hold anything else. When Mr. Archer emerged from his inner office, his expression was one of polite surprise. We had not met in years, not since he handled the probate for my father's estate. He was older now, his hair thinner, but his eyes still sharp. "Miss Sinclair," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "What can I do for you?" Followed him inside. The office was dim, the light filtered through green glass shades, and the only sound was the ticking of a brass clock on the wall. I set my satchel on his desk and began to take out the papers, one by one, laying them in careful order. Tax receipts, land registry entries, letters from my father and mother. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read, his eyes moving quickly but not carelessly. Every so often, he made a small noise in his throat, as though confirming something to himself. When he reached the 1964 letter naming me as joint holder of the estate with my father, he looked up. "This," he said, tapping the paper, "is significant. It means your interest in the property was never extinguished. Even with your father's passing and the subsequent management changes, your legal share remains intact unless you signed it away." "I didn't," I said quietly. "Then they can't simply remove you from the beneficiary list," he continued. "Not without your consent. Any allocation that excludes you entirely would be contestable, and likely overturned in court." I felt a slow, steady current of satisfaction move through me. "They're counting on me not knowing that," I said. He gave a small, wry smile. "Then let's make sure they continue to think that, for now." We spent the next hour mapping out the situation. He would make certified copies of every document, file preliminary notices to secure my claim, and quietly alert the registrar of deeds. No moves would be visible to the family yet. By the time I rose to leave, the brass clock had struck noon. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering dry leaves along the pavement. I stepped into it feeling heavier with knowledge, but lighter with certainty. They had been playing a game behind closed doors. Now so was I. They called it a family talk. Marissa found me in the corridor just after supper, her smile perfectly pitched between sweetness and authority. Henry and I were hoping to have a quick chat in the drawing room. Nothing formal. Just us. I followed her without comment. The drawing room was already arranged like a stage. Henry in the high-backed armchair, Stephen perched casually on the arm of the sofa, and Marissa in the center seat, a low table before her with tea service untouched. A plate of shortbread sat in the middle, as if this were a social visit. "Aunt Evelyn," Henry began, his tone warm but careful, "we've been thinking a lot about how to make this whole process easier for you." I lowered myself into the empty chair opposite them. "Easier," I repeated. "Yes," Marissa said, leaning forward slightly, hands folded in her lap. "We know the estate can be overwhelming. The upkeep, the taxes, the decisions. At your stage in life, it might be kinder to simplify things." "Kinder for whom?" I asked softly. Henry gave a quick, strained chuckle. "For everyone. We want to make sure you're comfortable, without the burden of managing all this." Stephen reached for the shortbread, breaking it neatly in half. "There's also the practical side," he said. "If we consolidate ownership, we can act faster on repairs, renovations, maybe even expansion. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." Marissa slid a cream envelope across the table toward me. "We've put together a proposal. Generous one. You'd receive a lump sum, more than fair market value for your portion, and we'd handle everything else. No more responsibilities." I didn't touch the envelope. Instead, I let the silence settle. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the windows. Somewhere deep in the house, a door creaked shut. Marissa's smile faltered first. Henry glanced at her, then back at me. "It's the sensible choice," he said. "You can take time for yourself. Travel. Relax." I folded my hands in my lap. "And in return, you get the whole of the estate." A flicker passed over Henry's face. There and gone again. "It's just paperwork," he said quickly. "We'd be keeping it in the family." I looked at the envelope, then back at them. My voice was calm, almost gentle. "I'll think about it." Relief washed over their faces, though it was too quick, too shallow. They thought they'd made progress. Henry rose to pour me tea I didn't drink. Marissa chattered about travel destinations I had no interest in. Stephen reached for another shortbread. They didn't notice that I left the envelope exactly where it was. 3 days later they asked me to meet them again, this time in the formal dining room. The long mahogany table was set with china and silver as if for a celebration, but the air was tight, expectant. Henry stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on the back of the chair like it was a throne. Marissa sat to his right, her posture impeccable, her smile too fixed. Stephen leaned against the sideboard, arms folded. "Aunt Evelyn," Henry began, "we were wondering if you'd had time to review our offer." "I have," I said, setting my leather satchel on the table. Marissa tilted her head, all false warmth. "And?" I opened the satchel slowly, deliberately. From inside, I withdrew a slim folder and placed it in front of me. "I've decided to keep my share of the estate," I said. "In fact, it's already been secured legally under my name." A stillness settled over the room. Stephen frowned. "What do you mean secured?" I met his gaze evenly. "I've confirmed my legal rights with Mr. Archer. Filed the necessary claims. My portion of the property cannot be transferred, sold, or leveraged without my explicit consent." Henry's hand tightened on the chair. "That's premature. We could have." "It's final," I said. My tone didn't rise, but it carried. "Furthermore, I've made arrangements for my share to be placed in a trust dedicated to the preservation of the estate's historic grounds. It will remain part of the Sinclair name, but outside your control." Marissa's lips parted, but no words came. The faint clink of the grandfather clock in the corner filled the space between us. Henry tried again, his voice strained. "You could have discussed this with us." "I could have," I agreed. "But given how discussions have gone so far, I preferred to act." I closed the folder, slid it back into my satchel, and rose from the table. "My solicitor will send you the details. You won't need to involve me further." No one moved to stop me. As I reached the door, Marissa's voice followed, brittle and breaking. "You've made this harder than it needed to be." I paused just long enough to reply without turning back. "On the contrary, I've made it simple." The rain had just begun when I stepped into Mr. Archer's office again. The smell of leather and paper felt like a steadying hand on my shoulder. He rose from behind his desk, the final set of documents already laid out in perfect alignment. "Everything is prepared," he said. "Once you sign, the trust becomes irrevocable. Your portion of the estate will be held in perpetuity for preservation. No one, not family, not future boards, can touch it." I removed my gloves and placed them neatly on the edge of the desk. "Let's begin." We worked in silence. The only sounds were the soft scratch of the pen across paper and the muted ticking of the brass clock on the wall. Each signature felt like a stitch closing an old wound. When the last page was complete, Mr. Archer gathered the papers, slid them into a deep green folder, and pressed the seal into the wax. The imprint, the Sinclair crest, shone for a moment in the lamplight before cooling into permanence. He handed me a copy. "This ensures your name remains tied to the estate's history, in the public record and in the trust's charter. They cannot erase you now, even if they tried." I ran my fingers over the embossed letters, feeling the weight of it. Not the weight of property or money, but of permanence. Outside, the rain tapped steadily against the windows. I thought of the house, the overgrown gardens, the quiet library, the worn rug in the drawing room. They were safe now, not because my family valued them, but because I refused to let them be dismantled for convenience. As I rose to leave, Mr. Archer asked softly, "Do you want me to notify them?" I shook my head. "They'll find out soon enough. Some things are best learned by opening the wrong envelope." He smiled faintly, and I stepped back into the rain, pulling my coat tight. The street smelled of wet stone and autumn leaves. It wasn't triumph I felt. Not exactly. It was something cleaner, quieter. A kind of peace that comes when you've taken back the part of yourself you didn't realize you'd lost. Dawn was only a pale blush on the horizon when I drove up the long gravel road to the estate. The gates were unlocked. They always were in the mornings, and the tires crunched softly over stones still wet from last night's rain. The house stood as it always had, its windows catching the first thin light. For a moment I just sat in the car, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Then I stepped out into the cold air, my breath blooming white in front of me. Inside, the corridors were still, the kind of stillness that belongs to old houses before they wake. My footsteps echoed faintly on the marble floor. The portraits on the walls watched me pass, their eyes sharper than I remembered. I walked slowly, touching nothing, until I reached the library. The scent of leather and old paper wrapped around me like a memory. On the far wall, beneath my father's portrait, stood his writing desk. The drawers were locked, but I knew the trick. A small catch under the right-hand edge that released them. I pressed it, and the top drawer slid open with a soft sigh. Inside, wrapped in a square of faded cloth, with a pocket watch and chain my father carried every day of his life. I lifted them out carefully, the weight of the brass warm in my palm. The watch was still working, its hands moving steadily toward the future. I stood there for a long time, the quiet ticking filling the room. This was all I needed to take. Not because I couldn't claim more, but because everything else that mattered was already secured. In law, in record, in the trust that bore my name. I closed the drawer, smoothed the cloth back over the empty space, and left the library without looking back. Outside, the air smelled of wet earth and distant wood smoke. Mist curled low over the lawns, blurring the edges of the gardens I had once tended with my mother. I paused on the steps, the watch still in my hand, and listened to the faint hum of the house behind me. They could keep the rooms, the furniture, the silver. They could fill the halls with their voices. But they would never remove me from the foundation. I slipped the watch into my coat pocket and walked toward the gate, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. Behind me, the house receded into the fog, its outline fading, but not disappearing. And neither would I. The sea has a way of teaching you about time. Waves arrive, crash, retreat, over and over without hurry, without pause. It's been 5 years since I last set foot in the Sinclair estate. I live now in a small house on the coast, the walls painted the color of pale sand, the windows always open to the salt air. I keep the pocket watch on my desk. It ticks steadily, a quiet metronome to the rhythm of my days. Most mornings, I rise before the gulls and walk the shoreline, collecting pieces of driftwood and sea glass. Life has grown smaller here, but fuller. Last week, a headline in the local paper caught my eye. Sinclair heir sells partial estate share amid financial strain. Henry's photograph sat above the article, the same polished smile, though a little thinner now. The piece mentioned rising debts, poor investments, and a need to liquidate. My trust was named as the steward of the remaining historic grounds, praised for its preservation work and public programs. I cut the article out, folded it, and tucked it into the back of my diary. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Some decisions ripple far beyond the moment you make them. Once a year, I travel back to the city for the Sinclair Preservation Trust's annual meeting. The venue is always the same, a converted gallery space in the old quarter, sunlight spilling through tall windows onto polished floors. When I arrive, the board members stand to greet me. Not out of obligation but out of respect. We go over budgets, restoration projects, community programs. I listen, offer my thoughts, and watch as the vision I planted years ago continues to grow without interference from the ones who once tried to erase me. After the meeting, I linger in the hall, looking at the photographs mounted along the walls, the restored gardens, the repaired east wing, the library reopened to the public. My name appears on the dedication plaque beneath each one. It's not vanity that moves me. It's permanence. The knowledge that what I fought for outlived the quarrel that birthed it. It was an October afternoon when I finally returned. Not as family, not as claimant, but as a guest. The gardens were alive with color. Russet leaves underfoot, late roses spilling their scent into the cool air. Volunteers tended to the beds, trimming, planting, preparing for winter. One of them, a young woman with soil on her gloves, looked up and smiled. "You must be Mrs. Sinclair," she said. "We've heard so much about you." Smiled back. "I'm Evelyn, and I've heard a great deal about this garden." We walked together along the gravel path, past the sundial, past the bench where my mother once read to me on summer afternoons. The house stood beyond, its windows catching the low sun. I didn't need to go inside. The trust saw to its care now. My name was written into its walls in a way paper alone could never hold. As I left, I took the pocket watch from my coat, wound it gently, and listened to its ticking mingle with the rustle of the autumn leaves. Time moves on. But some things, if you fight for them, remain exactly where they belong.